Welcome back to another episode of the MGA Library Podcast. I am joined today by a familiar face and a new face. I think I haven't been sleeping. Y'all might be hallucinations.
No, I don't think so.
Dance. No. I'm joined today by Monica Miller, Dr. Monica Miller. Can't forget the doctor. Hung.
I worked hard for the doctor.
Yeah. And once again with
Samantha
Wilcox. You mind telling us what your doctorate is in and what your position is?
Sure. So I am an associate professor of English. I'm also the coordinator for our graduate writing programs at Middle Georgia State. I've been here 7 years. Before that, I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Georgia Tech. And before that, I got my PhD at Louisiana State University in Southern Literature and Women's and Gender Studies. And my dissertation, which was on the figure of the ugly woman in Southern literature, is now the book Being Ugly, which you can find on the faculty shelf in the library.
Okay. Which LSU did you go to?
Louisiana, LSU, and Baton Rouge.
Oh, okay. Okay. So not Alexandria. Okay.
No.
Okay. I think less of you now.
Okay.
I think Dr. O'Leary Davidson, she went to Lafayette.
Oh, did she?
Mm-hmm. All right. We already did your introduction episode. Can I see that? Everybody else is prepared except me. Okay, so we're here to talk about Flannery Fest and what that entails. So what is Flannery Fest?
Well, this year, March 25th, marks Flannery O'Connor's 100th birthday. Flannery O'Connor is a very well-respected writer who spent much of her life in Milledgeville, Georgia, not that far from MGA. Many of our students have gone to see her house at Andalusia. Many of our faculty, such as myself, have written about O'Connor's work. And she, in addition to being the subject of a lot of continuing scholarly study, Flannery O'Connor is just somebody who continues to be a very popular writer. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that it was her 100th birthday and there are a lot of celebrations going on in various places, I wanted us to commemorate her birthday as well. Mm-hmm. And so when I reached out to other faculty and staff about it, I had a very, people were very excited to get on board and work on putting something together to celebrate her birthday.
Okay. So is this a national event or is this like a original idea?
We came up with it here.
Okay, so it's
over in Milledgeville, there's going to be, I think, there have been celebrations of her birthday, but the week of her birthday, I think there's something every day for a week at Georgia College, since that's her home. There's also, I think there's an event in Savannah, since that's where she's born, and just various people are celebrating her birthday, but we decided to really kind of do it up at MGA. We've got events happening on the Macon, Cochran, and Dublin campuses the week of her birthday. And the library has been a really wonderful partner in coming up with, and hosting and coming up with ideas for the events.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's because you pay us. So, do you have anything you would like to add? Okay. So, tell us, who is Flannery O'Connor? She was a writer, or she was
a writer. She was born in Savannah, Georgia. Her father, Edward O'Connor, and her mother, Regina Klein, were from very old Catholic families in Savannah, Georgia. And that's noteworthy because
it's very rare.
Right, there is not a lot of Catholicism in the Southeast. There is in Savannah. In fact, the house, you can go and you can tour the house that she was born in Savannah, and it's right, like if you look out the window where her crib was, you can see the Catholic Church just across the square. So she was, raised in the shadow of the church, and Catholicism and her Christian faith was very important to herself, to her personally, and is an important theme in her writing. The presence of grace in her life. So she was born in Savannah. She was born Mary Flannery O'Connor, Flannery being a family name, and up until she was in graduate school, she was known as Mary Flannery, and her family, in fact, still called her Mary Flannery. They moved around a bit Georgia. Her father got a job in Atlanta. They lived in Atlanta briefly, but she and her mother ended up spending quite a bit of her adolescence in Milledgeville, Georgia, where her mother's family is. And in fact, the Klein family mansion is a prominent house in downtown Milledgeville.
Mm-hmm.
Her father died when she was 16 of lupus, which is noteworthy in part because she was very close to her father. And it was rather a shock for him to die of lupus. Lupus is what she would die of. She had died in 1964 when she was 39 of lupus, which is the same illness that killed her father. But so she grew up quite a bit in Milledgeville. She went to what was then the Georgia State College for Women in the 1940s. It's what's now Georgia College.
I did not know that. That's interesting.
She got a degree in sociology and English literature. And she ended up going to the University of Iowa's graduate school in the 1940s. When she first got there, she thought that she wanted to be a comic artist. She had spent in high school and college, she did cartoons for the school newspaper, and she thought she was going to be a kind of James Thurber comic artist. But quite shortly after she got to Iowa, she went and spoke to the people in the writing program there. The Iowa Writers' Workshop had just started in the 1940s, and it's grown to be one of the most significant, important places of study for a writer. A lot of noteworthy writers who come out of the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and she was accepted into the workshop. She got her MFA at the University of Iowa. She then thought she was going to move to New York, be a fabulous writer. She ended up actually moving to Connecticut to stay with some friends of hers who were also writers. And she was going to live in their garage apartment. She did some babysitting in exchange for the room and board. That's when she was working on her first novel, Wise Blood, and it was during this time that the symptoms started emerging for that turned out to be lupus. There's one letter that she wrote that's in the archive at Emory where she's writing to her mother, and she says, I've been typing so much, but I can't even lift my arms up. It hurts to lift my arms. That was one of the first symptoms of what would be diagnosed as lupus. So she ended up ill, coming back to Milledgeville, living with her mother at the family farm in that's known as Andalusia. And she had pretty much most of her writing at her family home in Milledgeville. She was diagnosed with lupus in 1951. She moves back to Georgia then. And between 1951 and her death in 1964, she ends up writing 2 novels and 2 collections of short stories, and also had a very prolific letter writing life. Her correspondence has been collected and published. She also, when she was able to, would travel and give talks. So many of her essays have been collected and published as well. So most of the bulk of her writing life was done after her lupus diagnosis in Milledgeville.
Was that because that's all she could do because she had lupus? So
right. When you tour at the Andalusia farmhouse, her room is on the first floor. So that way she could be on the first floor. Her mother could tend to her. She was near doctors, and she was able to she occasionally went up to Atlanta for treatment. But yeah, she couldn't live on her own.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, we covered number 3, and you clarified she's dead. Sadly dead at 39?
39.
Good Lord.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of her, again, 2 novels, 2 short story collections, in really a period of 12 or 13 years.
So she only lived in Iowa, Connecticut, and Georgia. Okay.
I mean, do I want to age myself as the same age I am now as 39? I can't imagine.
I'll be 39 in 9 years. So Flannery O'Connor was a trained writer. Did she have any notion of did she have any previous writing experience before Iowa?
She did work on some short stories. And in fact, so she was, she's a very quotable writer. She was very fond of quipping things, especially in her letters. And there is she was known to make quips about that. Somebody asked her once if writing programs stifled writers, and she said the problem is they don't stifle enough writers. However, when she went to Iowa, so I published a collection of letters that she wrote to her mother when she was in Iowa, because we typically think of their relationship as being a really contentious one. She was always complaining about her mother. And while had a lot of
Isn't that
things
normal,
that yeah, exactly.
though?
Her letters from Iowa are things like, "Mother, please stop sending me aprons. Like, you've sent me 5 aprons. I don't need any more aprons. Please send me food." But she did.
I like a brisket every once in a while.
Well, there is something we will be celebrating at Flannery Fest. Is one of the highlights of the letters, I think, there's a 2-week period where she asked her mother to send her mayonnaise in every letter because the grocery store doesn't have any mayonnaise. It was the 1940s, and it did turn out, we did some research, and there was a shortage of mayonnaise in the Midwest in the 1940s because of post-war shortages and problems in supply chains. So once you I want some mayonnaise, then it becomes a thing. And so for 2 weeks, she's like, "Could you send me some mayonnaise?" At first she wants her mother to make her some mayonnaise and mail it, and we guess, we don't have Regina's letters, but we assume that her mother went, "Sweetie, that I don't want to give you botulism." And then when the mayonnaise comes, it's just the happiest day. But in her letters, in her earliest letters from Iowa, when she's writing to her mother, she does say, these people have things to teach me. I'm glad I'm here. And both in terms of the craft of writing, and then it was an important place for her, the professors that she had and the people that she met were people who ended up helping her with her career, people like Robert Penn Warren, who wrote All the King's Men and was the editor of an important a creative writing journal, helped her get published, helped her get different kinds of fellowships and things. So it was a very important place for her, both in terms of learning her craft, and she did see it as a matter of she was learning her craft. And so she did write to her mother that, there are things here for me to learn.
So was there a specific style they were being taught, or was it more of follow your own path, we're just going to guide you to a way?
Well, it was, so in the 1940s, one of the interesting things about the workshop at Iowa, and this is also the growth of MFA programs in general, of writing programs, this is really when they start happening in America. A big reason why they arose is as a result of the GI Bill. You had a lot of primarily men returning from war able to use the GI Bill, and a lot of them were using it to enroll in writing programs, and this was the time when kind of the Great American War Story was being written. And so a lot of her classmates were returned veterans who were writing the Great American War Story. And it's interesting that her first novel, Wise Blood, does start with a soldier returning from war, and he finds literally that his home is gone, and then he's also then kind of metaphorically looking for his home. But then, as with all O'Connor works, then it gets weird. But
it gets really weird.
It does.
I'm reading it right now.
Yeah. I don't know if you've gotten to the mummy part, but or the gorilla part, but yeah. So that was kind of in the air. Was kind of the Great American War Story. This is also the time of when a lot of the other writers that she would meet, the more established writers that she met, like Alan Tate at Vanderbilt and people like that, they were very much into the idea that that everything that you need to know about a story or a poem is contained within it. And so there was that kind of writing, that teaching of the craft of writing, that it should all be self-contained. But at the same time, she was also being given models to study and of what good writing is. And so the kind of mid-century appreciation of the traditional American canon of people like Nathaniel Hawthorne was somebody that she really admired, that she studied in school.
So would she be considered would that have been the complete opposite of Hemingway? Because he was very much the iceberg, right?
Right.
Like the little bit, and then it just explodes inward.
Well, but Hemingway, it's Hemingway's iceberg theory is more that there is an entire world that's built that isn't necessarily written explicitly about in the story, but it's influencing the story. Hers is more that you don't necessarily need to know that part of Wise Blood is referencing Oedipus's self-blinding, for example. You wouldn't need to know that to appreciate the story.
Okay.
But she's considered part of, certainly post-war writing is an important genre, category that she's included into. And then she also, of course, is very much considered a part of the Southern Gothic tradition, which many people trace the roots of the Southern Gothic back to Edgar Allan Poe. But certainly when she's writing, she's coming out of the school that she actually quipped and complained when asked about people like Erskine Caldwell. She complained that they were seen as what she called the school of Southern degeneracy. But I think that some people might consider her work as part of that Southern Gothic school of Southern degeneracy as well.
Okay. So was she a bit of like a, I don't know, what the humorist almost a little bit? Because sometimes she has very dark humor in her stories.
Right. I mean, certainly humor is a big part of her work. I once had a student come to my office hours after we read A Good Man Is Hard to Find, which has a lot of murder in it. And after a grandmother is murdered, the person who shoots her says she would have been a good woman if there had been somebody to shoot her every day of her life, which is funny. It's a great line, but it's about a woman who has just been killed. And one of my students came to my office hours upset because he said, I laughed at that line and I'm laughing about a death. And we talked about, well, why is it funny? Why do we laugh? And it was true about her that, it wasn't until she was literally looking down the barrel of a gun that she came face to face with her own mortality and realized that many people interpret it that she needed to change her ways. Other people interpret the ending of that story as she was just going to say whatever she could think of to try to keep the guy from killing her. But many people also interpret that it took being literally faced with her mortality for her to actually find grace and morality.
That was also probably one of the greatest twists in a story, because you thought when they got into the ditch, you thought the son was finally going to chastise her. And then they're like, what was that about, escaped convicts? And then just pop out of nowhere. I should not have read that story first, because that colored my opinion of her. I was like, the children were murdered. I didn't like that.
Well, but many of her, that's not the only story with gory death and dead children, and that runs through it. Violence runs through a lot. Unsettling violence runs through a lot of her work.
Did she have like a violent life, or was that just a vehicle to...
What she said when asked about why she wrote about such violence, first when she was asked about why she wrote about freaks in general, she said that in the South, and asked about why Southern literature in general seemed to have so many freakish people, she said it's because in the South we still recognize a freak. And she said that when I try to write realism, it's seen as freakish, and when I try to write freakish, it's seen as realism. But when asked about why she wrote such violence in her work, she said that she's trying to write about grace, like actual God-given, awesome, capital A, capital G grace. She said that grace is change, and that change is painful, and that she was trying to depict the pain of grace. And so that's where you have a lot of kind of epiphany moments in her work. That's a woman being shot with a gun, or a woman being gored by a bull, or a man being run over by a tractor. She's trying to depict that. The other kind of even more famous quip of hers was she was trying to explain the awesomeness of grace and the awesomeness of change to people perhaps who were not believers. Her explanation was famously, to the hard of hearing you shout, and to the nearly blind you paint large and startling figures. So she saw what she was doing as shouting to the hard of hearing.
So you said that pain was a revelation of grace. Was that colored by her lupus diagnosis?
I think some people definitely see that.
Okay. I forgot to clarify. You are a Flannery O'Connor scholar, correct?
Yep.
Okay. Is that your take on it, or do you have a special take on why she was doing that as well? Like,
well,
we covered the religious bit. What was the personal bit, or was there even?
My ideas change because I've been thinking about, one of the most challenging parts of being an O'Connor reader or scholar is that she died when she was 39. And it's interesting to compare her to somebody like Eudora Welty, who was a bit older than her, but Eudora Welty lived until 2002. She lived to a ripe old age. And some of her thoughts and ideas changed over her life. There's so many things that you wonder, in fact, when O'Connor was in graduate school, we see her letters. She grows up in a very racist white society. She goes to graduate school in Iowa, away from her family, away from her known community. And we start seeing her becoming friends with non-white people. Her mother came up and was appalled that they were eating in an integrated cafeteria. And her letter back to her mother is, look, Mom, like, get up with the times. Like, these are my colleagues, and yeah, I eat in an integrated cafeteria. Unfortunately, she went back to her all-white society in a lot of pain and continued in her personal letters to express racist opinions. One of my questions is, if she had not come back home, if she had been able to stay in Connecticut or New York and had a wider community, would she have reverted back to those things? And another question that I have is, would she have ever outgrown the shouting? In fact, I've given a talk a couple of times about one of the everything is strange about O'Connor, but one of the strange things about O'Connor is what an influence she has had on not just music, but punk music. There's the Ministry song, Jesus Built My Hot Rod, that samples Wise Blood. PJ Harvey wrote a song about Joy Helga. Gang of Four wrote a song based on No Man with a Good Car. And I wrote an article several years ago going, why are so many punk musicians into this Catholic writer from Georgia? And at that point, I thought it had something to do with, and I still think it has something to do with that she once said that that the moments of grace in her work were moments that excited the devil to frenzy. And I thought it was that exciting the devil to frenzy part that people were picking up on. And also, lines like no man with a good car needs to be justified is just a great line. But I've been thinking about it more about how in punk music, there is the desire to shout, both to be heard, right? There's this like, bad thing is happening, I need to shout, I need you to hear me yelling about it, and also the catharsis of shouting. But how many punk artists, after a while, get tired of the shouting. And in fact, I wrote in a conference paper and a talk that I've given about the artist Frank with a PH, who'd been in a punk band, got really mad in the early 80s when people started wearing Nazi insignia as part of their punk aesthetic, and she wrote this song called Take Off Your Swastika, and getting up and screaming take off your swastika felt cathartic to her at first, but then she realized people were just slam dancing and weren't listening to her words, so she turned it into an acoustic folk song. And she realized that to be heard, she actually needed to get quieter. And anybody who's been active in like political movements or anything knows that after a certain point, yelling in a march, you kind of feel like, okay, I've done that, what else can I do?
Kind of tuning them out almost.
Yeah.
So I would love to know if she would have reached a point where she might have tried to do something different. So that's what I've been thinking about lately about her, the violence in her work. Is I understand it as a kind of trying to, again, shout for the hard of hearing, but as I wrote about in my article, if you actually are trying to communicate with somebody who's hard of hearing, you have a tendency to shout, but if you actually want to communicate, you need to get closer and you need to slow down and enunciate. Shouting usually isn't the way to communicate with somebody who's hard of hearing.
Use cards.
Yeah.
Hang on.
But on the other hand, one of the original attractions for me of O'Connor, reading her when I was a teenager, and a lot of my students when they first read her, is, especially in the 1950s, we don't have a lot of angry women, young women figures. And, reading about characters like Mary Grace, who gets really fed up with an annoying woman in a doctor's office and throws her textbook at her. It was nice to have some angry young women to identify with.
Okay. In writing, in like characters, or like as a writer?
As a reader, here's a nice angry young woman. There aren't that many of them. There are plenty of angry young men in literature, but there aren't a ton of angry young women to read about.
Yeah, that's true. When you were saying that, I was starting thinking about Good Country People. Still one of the funniest twists. I've always been a nihilist. I'm gonna steal your leg. That was still one of the funniest stories.
And one of the best things about going to Andalusia is you can see the settings of these places. You can go see the hayloft where Joy Helga was.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You can go in the barn and say that's where Joy Helga was.
Oh, that's cool. So, how would you describe her writing style? You mentioned realism.
Right. It's also very Southern Gothic. I mean,
Okay.
Southern Gothic, and as we're talking about, they're very unusual situations, like having a traveling Bible salesman steal a woman's prosthetic leg, or having an annoying woman in doctor's office. That she actually was in her doctor's office and started just to keep herself busy, started just writing the story Revelation while she's waiting.
What if my doctor was annoying?
Well, no, she's just writing all the people in the waiting room who are bugging her. They're just, they ended up in her story.
Oh, really?
It's
Oh,
like
that's
the
funny.
coffee mug that says, don't annoy the writer or you'll end up dead in their novel.
Okay.
So there's darkness, there's comedy, and there's also, these epiphanic moments of change.
Mm-hmm. And did she have any biblical style inspirations to it, or was it just her faith, just period?
I think that you can see the influence of the lives of the saints in a lot of her works, which are also very violent stories. So I think that definitely the lives of the saints. There have been people who have there's certainly quite a bit of biblical allusion in her stories. Some people, there's one, I think it's part of a book that shows the parallels between Paul and Hazel Motes in Wise Blood. So she definitely has quite a bit of biblical allusion and Catholic allusion in her work, I think.
Okay. Does she use regional dialects in her writing? Kind of like how Stephen King, I believe it was It. There were a couple of characters who spoke phonetically, like it was written.
Oh, does she use dialect?
Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly.
Not It. Christine.
Okay.
How the car salesman was speaking in a heavy Maine accent, and he wrote it out that way.
Yeah. No, there is a lot of vernacular in her work.
Vernacular, that was the word I was looking for.
Yep.
Too many words in my brain. So was she known mostly for her short stories, or was she mostly known for her novels?
Well, so she wrote 2 novels. The first and her first work was Wise Blood, her novel. So that kind of made the big splash. And if you're reading Wise Blood right now, you can imagine the frustration she felt when her family would ask her things like, "Oh, so is this like that lovely Margaret Mitchell's book? Is this like Gone with the Wind?"
No, it ain't. No.
No, it's not. But I think that her short stories are some of the most widely anthologized short stories. I mean, if you take a college survey of American literature class, you're likely going to read Flannery O'Connor, because they are such masterful short stories. I mean, you mentioned A Good Man Is Hard to Find. At the end of it, when the misfit appears, there have been some great analyses of that story, of just how perfectly crafted it is as a story. We get the misfit in the first paragraph, and who then returns at the end of it. It's just a really well crafted story.
Was it mentioned in a news broadcast, or was it mentioned in a newspaper that they were reading? I can't remember.
It was in a newspaper.
It was in a newspaper. Okay, I couldn't remember if it was on the radio or something.
No, it was in a newspaper at the beginning of the story, when the grandmother's trying to convince them that she wants to go to Tennessee and not to Florida. They should have listened to the grandmother and gone to Tennessee.
Yeah.
So for someone who's never read a Flannery O'Connor story, where do you suggest they start?
My favorite story is probably still Good Country People, partly because I just identify with the grumpy intellectual teenage. Well, actually, she's not teenage. She's teenage, but she's actually 30-year-old woman who's just had it with everybody and thinks that she knows better than everybody. And I do. I just love that story. And also, traveling Bible salesman steals her leg. The wonderful backstory on that story. So she'd actually written the collection of stories that would become A Good Man Is Hard to Find. She hadn't written Good Country People yet. She'd actually sent the collection to the publisher, and so she's in Milledgeville, And occasionally people from the college would, be like, oh, do you want to meet our famous Miss O'Connor who wrote Wise Blood? And they, one of the people who she met was this person named Eric Langsher. He was a textbook salesman. He traveled around the country. He was a textbook salesman. He was from Denmark. He was a traveling textbook salesman. He had this kind of book of samples. And we have plenty, people, textbook salesmen still come around here, saying, hey, what are you teaching? Do you need a textbook for it? Let me show you the books we have. So he had this sample collection of samples from their textbooks that he referred to as his Bible, that he would show people. And he and Flannery struck up a friendship, and they had something kind of like a courtship. And she had quite a crush on him. He ended up having to move back to Denmark, and she received a letter from him announcing his engagement. And so she wrote Good Country People. And she sent it to him, and then she sent it to her friend Carolyn Gordon, who read a lot of her work, and who shared it with her husband Alan Tate. Both of them were really well-respected writers. And they basically had a stop the presses moment where they called up the publisher and said, this story needs to be in that collection. So when I teach it, my students often refer to that as her Taylor Swift story of, you break up with Flannery O'Connor, you get that story written about you. And she, when he wrote back and went, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize that I'd hurt you so much. She's like, this is not about you. No, what are you talking about? But to me, that just,
she's Carly. She's the Carly Simon.
Yeah, so that once I learned that the story was actually inspired by somebody, that gave it a whole other dimension to it.
So she was never married? She was single for her whole life? That's interesting.
Again, she only lived to be 39. Yeah, her world was rather limited in Milledgeville. Most of her time in Milledgeville, she was on crutches.
I didn't know that.
And when you go and tour her house, they have her crutches by the door, by her desk.
Okay.
Although she did say, one of her stories is titled "The Lame Shall Enter First," which is a Bible verse. But she quipped, because she quipped all the time. She quipped to a friend once that the lame shall enter first because we'll trip all the others with our crutches, so we can get there first.
She was very witty.
She was. Dealing with, a life of pain and illness, she definitely used comedy to deal with it. And she was just clever.
So what are some of the topics that you will be discussing during Flannery Fest?
So we will have Dr. Melva Jones is going to give a talk about lupus, about what lupus is. And then we're going to have librarian Mark Inslee, who is also my husband. The two of us collaborated on a article. We went to Andalusia, where they have her archives, and they have an archive of her clothes. And so the archivist setup has a mannequin the size of O'Connor, and Mark did just gorgeous photography of her clothes. And I think y'all are going to float up the pictures, and Mark is going to answer questions about them. Because to me it was notable. I was really surprised, and I shouldn't have been, but I was really surprised at how colorful everything was. But I realized all of the pictures I've seen of Flannery O'Connor, I think, have been in black and white. But
there's hard to see color in that.
Yeah. But you think about how much she loved birds and how much she loved peacocks. It makes sense that she liked colorful things. And in fact, the picture that they chose for the cover of the Flannery O'Connor review that Mark took, it is the cutest dress. It's a green dress and has little green chickens on it, and lots of bright colors. So we'll be looking at those photographs. The English Students Organization is going to be discussing the story of the displaced person, which is a story that she wrote based on what really happened. So in the 1940s and 50s, refugees from Eastern Europe were brought over to America and worked. Flannery's mother hired several European refugees to work in Andalusia as a way of bringing people over to save them from the Holocaust. And so she wrote this story, The Displaced Person, who came over to work on a farm. They made a movie of it in the 1970s that they actually filmed at Andalusia. And young Samuel L. Jackson is in the film. So you can watch it on YouTube. And so we're going to discuss whether the students want to read the story or watch the film. We'll be discussing The Displaced Person. And then we're also just going to have some fun crafts and games in the library and snacks that the library is providing.
And what day is it going to be?
It is going to. So the Macon campus events are Tuesday, March 25th in the morning. We will have events on Monday and Tuesday in Dublin, and I believe on Tuesday in Cochrane. And then there will also be a week beforehand in the Writing Center. There will be a display about O'Connor.
You got anything you want to ask?
I don't think so. I think you covered everything.
Okay.
We don't want
So
to give the games away. We don't want to give the games away.
no,
Surprise.
no, the games are a surprise.
Yeah.
And the crafts.
And
the crafts are going to be fun too.
Yes.
Pin the fake leg on the woman.
No.
Okay, well, we can move on into the final bit, an optional bit, where you can ask me a question about anything.
Tell me what you're thinking of Wise Blood.
Lord have mercy. It's. I could have done without the epithets, the constant use of the N word. I could have. It would have been nicer if she used a more tamed version, but then again, that's what they used back then.
And you'll notice that it's interesting to notice which characters use racist language and which do not.
The main character is so appealing because he's so adamant about moving. Because so this guy comes back from the war. War devastates people. He comes back. He's like, I'm going to start an anti-church, and it's like, oh, this is interesting. And then I had known that she was religious, and I'm religious as well. And I'm like, it's amazing how she was able to encapsulate the atheist from her point of view. And I was like, oh, that's so amazing. But it's so funny that he keeps getting mistaken for a preacher because he has the wide brim hat.
Yep. And he feels kind of, well, I think the line is Christ will have him in the end. Christ did have him in the end. That, he feels like he can't escape it. And she described when she was asked about religion in the South, kind of another famous phrase of hers, is she said that it's not that the South is Christ-centered, but that the South is Christ-haunted.
Ooh.
And so I think that Wise Blood is very much an expression of this concept of the Christ-haunted South, the way that Hazel Motes is trying to constantly escape it. Have you seen the movie?
It's on Max, and I have it queued up till when I finish. But I do know that it was filmed in Macon.
That was my introduction to Macon, was coming here to see where Wise Blood had been filmed.
Oh, it hasn't changed.
Well, they showed it right after I moved here in 2017. They had a showing of it downtown, and some Mercer professors talked about it. And one of Dr. David Davis's students came, and he offered them extra credit to come. And I don't even know if he offered extra credit for this, but I hope the students got. There were 2 people dressed as gorillas who came to the Wise Blood showing. But there were people there too who remembered like when they filmed it, and some of the people there talked about remembering the filming of it.
I have gotten to the point where he's talking to the blind preacher. I've gotten to that point with his young daughter. And I don't trust him. I'm like, oh. I've read too much. I think I know what's going to happen. I'm such a voracious reader. I could figure out a story, how it's going to end, how it's going to be within the first chapter.
I think you'll still find some surprises.
Oh, it's her, but yeah, but I'm like, it's still going to be cool when it happens and I'm right. I'm like, oh, that's cool. But it's fascinating. There's not a lot of scenery in it. I've noticed. I don't know if that comes along later. It's more of the descriptions of the people than of the location. I think I kind of like that.
There are interiors, like there's the bus station with Leora Watts's name written on the wall. There's the description of her interior. There's the description of it's interesting to think that there are more kind of interior descriptions, I think, than exterior ones. And of the shiffer robe that, has the rope tied around it. But you're right. Some of her stories do have very descriptive scenes of nature. But certainly not Wise Blood, you're right, is more of a interior rooms. Oh,
I should have. dang. Let's go back to another question because
Okay.
you just mentioned that. Did she plan around symbolisms? Because she has a lot of symbolism in her stories. Did she plan around them, or were they just organically created?
They just were organically created, and she saw the kind of writing that she did as being kind of reflected of a deeper reality, a deeper reality of grace and forces of evil and forces of good. So she saw as what she was doing as kind of reflecting that, but in terms of the symbolism, she didn't plan that. In fact, one time somebody wrote her wanting to know the symbolism. My teacher wants me to write about the symbolism of, I think it was a black hat or something, and she's like, the hat's black because it's a black hat.
Is that the origin of the curtain is blue because the curtain is blue?
I think that was another author. But I think that most writers, if you ask them, say that such symbolism just kind of emerges organically. Because if you try to write, I am going to write about this symbolism, it tends up not to be very great writing.
No, I've experienced that firsthand.
I do regret that she never wrote. I should go and double check, but I'm pretty sure that mayonnaise does not appear in any of her stories, which is too bad.
But it will appear at Flannery Fest.
Was mayonnaise her mana?
But you look at what her interests are, like birds. She loved birds, and so birds do show up in her work.
Growing up, after I read A Good Man Is Hard to Find, I was adamantly against ever reading Flannery ever again because I was like, oh, it's horrible. How could they do that? And then as I got older, I had more experience. I was like, I get it now. I still don't like the story, but I get it.
Well, or even just interesting little details. The end of Good Country People, when Joy Helga is stranded in the hayloft, the first person and the last person we see is
the mother, right?
Well, no, the woman who works for the mother.
Okay.
And she sees Manly Pointer, the Bible salesman, and the way he's walking, it looks like he's walking on the lake. It looks like he's walking on water.
Oh, I need to reread that.
But again, it doesn't hit you over the head with it. But took somebody else pointing out. You realize that it looks like Manly Pointer is walking on water.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I don't think there's symbolism that hits you over the head, but there are some really interesting things that emerge.
Okay. Do you have any?
No.
No?
I don't think so.
Cool. All right. Well, I look forward to Flannery Fest.
Well, I'm grateful to the library for hosting the events of Flannery Fest. The library and the Writing Center are both hosting events for us.
All righty. Well, this has been another episode of the MGA Library Podcast. This episode will actually appear the week before Flannery Fest.
Wonderful.
As a way to roll it in. I am very happy to have you here. It's fun talking to you. I need to figure out another way to get you back on because I enjoyed talking to you. That was really fun.
I'm always happy to.
And I'm joined once again by Sam Wilcox. Have a wonderful day. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Adios.